Welcome to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lipman. Today we are interviewing Reverend David William Parry. This is part 1 of 3 of this podcast. Tell us, I'm going to begin with a question. Does the devil exist?
Right. Oh my God. I see a picture of, I believe it's you shouting behind you. Good Lord, Richard. I'm meant to be a progressive. Therefore, how dare you insult me? Yes and no. Yes and no. Are people capable of acts of irrational wickedness? Well, I mean, let's take one look around the world at the moment, and the answer is consummately yes. Why would people choose the perverse? Why would they choose to do what is wrong when the right thing is in front of them, and hold to that decision? That is, of course, one of the great philosophical, theological mysteries of all time. Certainly in ancient cultures, they believed there was an author of those particular impulses, those particular choices, which did not come from the divine. I'm tempted to say, yes, there's some sort of evil principle, at some lofty level or other. I don't like sort of operatic, demons running around the stages at the stage with horns and pitchforks. And, it must be something awfully more serious than that. So, I rather like sort of Thomas Aquinas's view, the great Roman Catholic architect of medieval theology, and a lot since, where, evil is a falling away from what is good. Therefore, if there is an entity like that, and if that entity was close to the divine, which cannot by definition really be pinned down. We know certain things, nevertheless, that source of all life and being is good, it's beautiful, it's true. Therefore, if evil is a falling away from all of that, we have this terrible notion of something lacking goodness, lacking beauty, lacking truth, and descending ever more into the grossly and inhumanely irrational, perverse, and wicked. So yes, I'm tempted to say, it depends on different parts of my career whether I say yes or no to that, and normally it's in the middle. I'd say after recent events in world history, I'm tempting much more towards the fact of a yes somewhere or other, although in no way, of course, does that ever rival the divine principle. I mean, by definition, it couldn't. How about that for a nicely evasive answer, Richard?
Yes, David, that's interesting. Where in the Bible can we find examples of wickedness? Are there specific places?
I think the Bible is an incredibly misunderstood book, by which I mean the Hebrew scriptures as well as the Christian scriptures. I don't like fudging the issue of its. I think American evangelicals like fudging it, and therefore, with respect to them, don't really do justice to either. The story of Israel itself, the story of Judaism, is the Old Testament, and it must be taken not only as history, but philosophy, as psychology, as poetry. Therefore, I think if we're going to really value the texts in the way that they're supposed to be, I don't really like that. I mean, you could say, the Old Testament is the story of a people, a nation, a way of responding to the environment, to the cosmos, whereas the Greek New Testament is really the story of a human being caught in that predicament and what happened then. Certainly, there are examples of moral wickedness all the way through. There are examples of things going sadly wrong, and therefore no one's clearly to blame. I mean, every now and again, the evil spirit does turn up, but more or less as an accuser in the great assize of the Almighty, the prosecuting lawyer that will produce all the things that you did wrong on the great day of judgment. And you, of course, have the defense lawyer, either as the prophets or as the Messiah, depending on what angle you're coming from, who will then give the case for the defense. Is that a simple notion? By no means would I say that. I think that is highly complex. Certainly, you have the notion of the morning star falling like lightning. I mean, that's mentioned in Isaiah. And sort of, if we look at the Greek New Testament, the temptation in the wilderness. But I think the minute you're dealing with sacred text, you're dealing with scripture, one can't really approach those things on the level of a novel or the level of a philosophical essay, because by definition and design, so many other levels were woven into that from the start, from the beginning, that really it's impossible to pin down. It can only be revealed century by century by century, to my mind, and unpacked and reinterpreted and visited afresh. And I think that's the beauty. Also, I do believe certain bits. I mean, we're not looking at anything like a Quran, no matter what that book is supposed to be. There's a Quran in heaven, and there's a Quran on earth, and then the big row for the Islamic community is actually monstrous. Is the Quran on earth the same as the Quran in heaven? And I don't know how anybody checks that. And there have been different versions of the Quran. I mean,
what do they say?
well, I mean, I modern troubles to the side for one moment. I don't think you can see Islam as outside of the Abrahamic stream of revelation. And certainly the great Muslim mystics, the great Muslim philosophers would have been horrified if anybody said that. I mean, their view in the early days, so I'm not talking about recent politics and what happened, and what has happened, around our ears recently. They would have seen it very much as the introduction of the laws of Abraham to that part of the world. Therefore, they were looking at an assertion of the Old Testament, the values of the Old Testament in those particular cultures. And their view of evil, of course, is ultimately everything comes from God. Well, that's a very good argument. Certainly, I can't think of many of the great rabbis that would have gone along with that. I'm not saying none. They would have been very, very wary of not only trying again to pin the divine principle down. I mean, how on earth can you do that? But then to start telling everybody what its nature is like. So with the Quran, you're looking at a book that's totally inspired and divine in origin. With the Bible, you're looking at something that is partially inspired. I don't think anybody of worth or value has said every single jot, tittle, and letter is inspired. Some people do say that. Certainly, unless you want a very modern approach in the progressive sense that I don't really follow myself, there would be no inspiration at all. I think certain sections are inspired. So then we're looking at something else, parts of a text which are not simply of human origin.
Well, who do you think? Where do you think the Bible comes from? There are the Dead Sea Scrolls found.
Yeah.
Is it possible that I think during the 6th century or the Romans decided to edit parts of the Bible for various reasons?
One must never forget, do lepers ever change their spots? Do the political class ever change their reaction to the human condition? I doubt it. Would the Romans have been willing and able to do that? Of course. If we want an idea of what the Roman Senate was like, all we have to do is look at America today. With the backstabbing, the lies, and I don't mean a particular side, I mean everybody, jockeying for position. Anyone potentially can be president. They all know that. So anyone can be Caesar. They all know that. And keeping, the great families constantly jockeying for position, exactly like now. I mean, the figure that always haunted me from the New Testament was Pontius Pilate, who strikes me as, I don't think he's caught in the middle of events at all, who strikes me as this indifferent Roman politician. Can it just all go away? I'm having tea this afternoon. Can it just all go away, please? So that's a very modern character suddenly surfacing a long time ago. Yeah, but it happened before that, Richard. During the Babylonian captivity, I mean, there were, because there are traces of them, extra books, additional books to the Bible. We have what is left. I mean, the Babylonians, how about this? We're raking over old coals. They were no friends of Israel because Israel was a slave race to them. It was something conquered and conquerable. And we, rather like nowadays, they simply didn't care what it said. Unlike the Persians, curiously, who cared about everything Israel said. That's a different issue. So, I mean, it was one of the biblical commentators who said, let's try and gather together what's left of the scripture, and this is our Bible. This is what is left of it. So I'm sure it has a history, it has a textual history as well as a religious history. And a great deal has been lost along the way, sadly. So what we're trying to do as Jews and Christians, in all humility, is piece together what we can and use those yardsticks as a guide and a measure in our personal and collective lives today. Does that help clarify that?
Yes. Today, there's been possibly a fall in people going to places of worship, especially in the Christian world. There's sort of a small rise in sort of other beliefs such as paganism, and I think even in 1924 or in the 20s there was someone called H.P. Lovecraft who created
Yeah,
Arabic title Al-Asif, and
yeah,
sort of textbook of magic.
yeah.
People want to believe in the supernatural. What's your take on that?
Well, let's start with the easy one first. By definition, again, if you look, don't forget my take on all of this largely comes from academic philosophy. So, by definition, only one thing can be supernatural, and that is God. Therefore, God cannot be discussed because we don't know what the supernatural is. There are no frames, there are no checks, there are no balances, there's nothing comparative. Therefore, God can't be discussed in any meaningful way. All we can do is discuss by imputation and alleged activity. Everything else is within the sphere. I mean, even ghosts, there's a location, they're measurable, they move from room to room. You can sort of pin certain things down on a locational and psychological level. I mean, by definition, a divine principle, you can't. I've no time for Lovecraft outside the world of literature. A better example is Aleister Crowley, who I think is awfully misunderstood. Was he a good boy? No. I mean, he's a an Edwardian decadent. He doesn't want to be a good boy. You're looking at the time when basically Europe's going through a major upheaval in self-understanding, the time of the decadence in the arts. I mean, so Crowley's this sort of proto-Renaissance decadent. I love his paintings. I can't stand his poetry. One of my favorite stories is they were in a mystical group called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, him and quite a few notables from the period. W.B. Yeats was a member, and he showed some of his contemptible poetry to W.B. Yeats. And the story is Yeats went completely quiet and didn't know what to say. Surprise, surprise, the guy that's on his way to winning a Nobel Prize. But Crowley's not the type of person to be back-footed. So he said it was obviously clear jealousy that the man couldn't say anything. I mean, he's a much better a better example, I think, of a man seriously trying to introduce magical systems, whatever that means. Whereas I think Lovecraft is really, I mean, let's not be unfair to him. He's a novelist. Certain people have taken his uncanny insight into the id at face value. I don't think that's particularly helpful, and I don't know if he'd have liked that or not. Probably. I mean, he's trying to flog books, isn't he? But I don't think he'd have found that particularly helpful in his corpus.
What does he say about it?
It's old. He's trying to sort of soup up certain ideas of how Americans see black magic So you're looking at something tainted in that particular culture by the Salem witch trials, which no credit to anybody. I mean, let's face it, they're no credit to anybody. So dark forces, and he re-describes them all in terms of chaos. So I mean, actually, those descriptions are there in the past. But that's one of the things that brought him to the reading public's attention. I mean, they were all published in fanzines back in the day. I mean, he didn't get a book deal. Scary Halloween stuff with various things, squids and what have you, and goats and all the typical paraphernalia of a Gothic worldview, and done brilliantly in an American fashion. I think that's how it all sort of went forward. I mean, in terms of religious attendance, I've never really thought Britain or the British, and that includes all of us, were particularly religious at any point in history. I think we're very spiritual, curiously. If people look at the amount of yoga classes and the amount of meditation sessions and the amount of New Age gatherings and get-togethers, then you see a very different picture. You see people really who've gone back to what the religious impulse was all about in the first place. How am I fitting into the cosmos around me? And you don't really need organized religion for a large part of that journey. And organized religion is constantly letting everybody down in so many ways at the minute. So, yes, I think the resurgent tradition is what it says it is, the resurgent tradition. And hopefully that floats on people's boats. I think it's encouraging. You're full of, beautiful iconography, the music, the vestments. I mean, it's all beautiful. So as an aesthetic, that needs to survive. And I think certainly, am I encouraged or discouraged by that? Neither. I just think it's, that's showbiz in the sense that is what happens. I mean, I think we're a very spiritual nation. I mean, America is meant to be religious, isn't it? But that tends to mean ideology as opposed to anything theological. The Americans have this awful history of dressing up their ideology in religious gowns and then pretending it's religion. And good for them if that's what they want to do. That doesn't strike me as what the prophets were aiming at. As learned Rabbi Hillel speaking about the Christians. If this is of God, it will continue. Could that be said about the Americans? I'm not sure. But I think the religious, like most Europeans, to be honest, like you and me, there's a great impulse. There's a spiritual impulse there, and we try and find what that means in our lives, in our situation, and that's all good. Which is why I tend to kick people like H.P. Lovecraft into touch. For one simple reason. He wasn't trying to do that when he was alive, and his books aren't really trying to do that. They're trying to tell a good yarn and entertain. If he was on this call now, I think he'd be absolutely bamboozled, to use an American term, that anyone was even thinking that. That comes afterwards because the power of his imagination has really seized people with that sort of American Gothic view. But that for me is really what's happening at the minute. I don't think you can see him as part of any revival. And if people do, then it's the sort of dark revival of putrescence. It's the revival of cultural decay. It's not really the revival of any type of spiritual search or quest. That would be my response to that.
Have you traveled to the Middle East, Israel, Palestine?
It's strange you say that. I've always wanted to, and I've always held back. For me, the places do have religious significance. On one level, I'm going to say something that might sound very easy to misunderstand. We can't deny the bloodshed. We can't deny that the violence. I mean, century after century. I'm not referring to now. But that doesn't mean these places aren't sacred and aren't holy. I mean, that's what human beings are like. I think we tend to remove that from the equation far too quickly. Is that a shame, and can we all do better? Of course. But that is what human beings are like. I've always held back because of the sanctity of the places, not because I feel I'll be disappointed. If someone like me goes to Jerusalem and starts looking for the stone where the Blessed Virgin stubbed her toe, I mean, whatever. I can't imagine anything more wonderful and more trivial at the same time. Um, and there are places, the actual tomb and this, that, and the other. So would it be interesting on the level of tourism? Yes. Would it be slightly more than that? Of course. And I don't simply mean the historically active imagination. You'd be walking the streets where a great mystery took place for me. And even in terms of Judaism, you're walking the streets of the prophets, you're walking the streets of the Torah, you're walking the streets of where spiritual history is trying to touch humanity in a much more disclosure and revelatory way than maybe other cultures. That's why I've held back. For me, I think the overwhelming nature of walking through those streets in real time, looking at people doing their daily shopping, arguing, screaming, shouting, fighting, kids running around playing, people on their way to prayer, people having finished that, restaurants, cafes. For me, I'd have found that overwhelming. I'm now actually in the place whereby, therefore, I've held back. I know one day I've got to do that if the angels allow that. I've done a lot of traveling and I've seen a lot of the world, but as I say, the long answer to that and the short answer is no, but for religious reasons. Curiously, I'd need to be very prepared to do that internally.
What was the place where you felt most spiritually uplifted in the world?
Oh my heavens! Probably Glastonbury. Um, I got a guided tour of the Vatican years back. I mean, it's overwhelming experience of art. So if anybody, I mean, what do people normally talk to me about art? There's overwhelming religious phenomena. So every single room and every single place was art. So I couldn't say a thing. And I went quiet, and everybody thought I went quiet, but for slightly different reasons for the ones I was going quiet. Oh my God, there's another Michelangelo. So I went completely quiet in a different way. Because Glastonbury has so many mythic associations. It's very, very pretty. It's a beautiful place. It's very English. Do I think it's very Saxon? It's very Celtic. It's very Roman. It's all a bit rolled into one. It's a place where myth touches history. What is myth? Sort of coagulated, coalesced, sacred narrative. It's never designed to be taken literally. Again, our ancestors would have been horrified at that. But these are meaningful stories about the human condition, about all of us. So the Arthurian cycle and the great poetry, and of course, as the centre of the British counterculture, which I count myself as part of. So I think it was actually visiting Chalice Well and the tour, Glastonbury tour, with the sort of what's left of the Shrine of St Michael. For me, that was there was an uprush of inspiration and sort of deeper levels of meaning than usual.
What is the Shrine of St Michael?
Well, I mean, on the top of Glastonbury tour, you have this sort of needle-like structure, which is people disagree. Some people say it was part of a bigger structure. Some people say, well, it's basically that, a single tower dedicated to St. Michael, which is very impressive and very beautiful. And why is it there? And yada yada yada. And as I say, Chalice Well, where King Arthur is associated. And it was, I don't know, I just kept thinking of all the authors, international as well as British, who'd been there, and I kept thinking of A Glastonbury Romance by John Cooper Powys, and all the literature and all the text and all the inspiration that had come from that place. The tour included, the tower included. Yeah, for me, that was I don't know. I find the world a very sacred place generally. I find it a profane place as well. I don't think you can have is there anywhere that hasn't been profane at one point or other? Not really. Sacred is the sacred is a place, is a feeling, is a psychology, and when people get together and somehow interact with more than themselves, so that also can be anywhere. I don't think these things are meant to be geographical in the crude sense of the word. There is this particular place which is associated with A, B, C, and D. Was there a time when Jerusalem itself was not sacred? Of course. Will there be a time, possibly in the incalculable future, where it isn't again? Possibly. We can't rule it out, because sacred concerns humanity resonating with their own meaning and more than their own meaning. So for me, and I'm not saying it's a view anybody else needs to share, for me, everything is profane and everything is sacred, depending on the time frame, the narrative, and what we're trying to achieve at a particular place in a particular time.
Have you personally experienced the divine or God or spirit? And how did it feel?
Oh my God, it was just so amazing. I don't think it's as difficult to experience the divine as people say it is. I think lots of people block it out in the modern world. Why? Because everybody's wicked? No. Why? Because we live in an evil, atheistic society? Actually, I don't think we do. It's because we're all beings, human beings are human beings. We're beings of the immediate. We're beings of the moment. We've got partners. We've got careers. We've got our own needs, our own mental health, our own spiritual health, our own physical health, none of which is wrong. I mean, it's all part of who we are and what we are. And those things easily drown out anything much more subtle and much more profound and deep. It's really in the moments of quiet and the moments where we can be attuned, that word, to whatever, is good and beautiful and true in our own lives. That those moments, arise. I mean, in terms of personal psychology, I actually had a dream when I was 12 years old of encountering Christ. A very, very bizarre experience. My parents, my family wasn't particularly religious. I got sent to bed early, and I was still in the right. I'm still in the right. I did absolutely nothing wrong to deserve that. I got sent to bed early by my parents when we all lived in Ferrum in Hampshire. Grudgingly went to my bedroom. I can't remember what the row was about. Grudgingly went to my bedroom and don't remember falling asleep. I remember it was this sort of wonderful Southern English, bright, sparkling evening, beautiful, beautiful summer evening. I don't remember falling asleep. I do remember suddenly being in the middle of an Elysian field, and to either side were very Jewish-looking figures dressed in long robes, and they were discussing something, and I was looking to the left and looking to the right. They were stood either side and thinking, what on earth is all this? Where am I? And a Christ figure suddenly emerging in the middle and saying to me, "Are you ready?" And to my child's mind, I thought, whoever this is, I actually did think that, whoever it is, I'm being asked to die. And I don't want to die. I'm a kid. My life is starting. So I said no. And the scene dissolved, and it was the next morning. So obviously it was some type of dream. My immediate reaction was, oh my heavens, I've said no to God. No matter what God asks, you should say yes. I had this terrible feeling of guilt for a couple of hours, until weirdly, and everybody could smell it, there was this incredible perfume of roses throughout the entire house. And for me, that was a sign of forgiveness, a sign that whatever this phenomena was, it was unpacking. It wasn't there and then at the same time. Was that part of the reason I went on a religious as well as a spiritual journey? Yes. Do I think that's anything more than a dream? Not really. But the significance of a religious dream in itself, I think, is worth evaluating. I take Jung very, very seriously in these matters. I take Freud very, very seriously in these matters. They wouldn't have been quick to say, let's kick that into touch. And that's only one dream amongst others. Both of them, for different reasons, would have said, well, no, that's a religious dream that needs study. What does that mean for you as a person? What's the psyche doing? What's the psyche saying? And I think probably they both arrive at different conclusions. I think Freud needs a revamp nowadays. I think he's very misunderstood. In Jung's terms, in Jungian terms, the archetype. I've actually interacted with the archetype for some unknown reason. And I tend to react to these things in those sorts of ways. It's difficult not finding the presence of God in music. It's difficult not finding the presence of God for me in art, by which I mean paintings, poetry, the great works of literature. It's incredibly difficult for me not finding the direct presence of God in acts of kindness. I mean, the one thing I'd love any natural behaviorist to explain to me is an unpremeditated act of kindness. There's no biological value, there's no survival value, there's no need for it at all. And that somehow is overwhelmingly beautiful when someone does something kind to somebody else for no reason. That goes against rigid biological theories. And it says something about a different and deeper type of human nature. And the minute you're talking about those things, for me, you're on religious territory. I think some of the great psychologists, I tend to come to it all from that angle, Richard. They had a great deal to say about these things. And I think that journey and that quest and that narrative is really only just beginning. Why is secular psychology, if psychology has ever been secular, why is counseling secular, if it's ever been secular? I'm thinking there are people like Carl Rogers, who ended up saying some of the most mystical things. I mean, it's all written in a very scientific language, but some of it's mind-blowingly mystical. People, like Moreno, Jacob L. Moreno, who's tantamount to a saint to me, who started drama therapy, who actually confronted Freud at one point. I mean, Freud didn't want God concepts in the therapy room. He thought that was a real pain. You had to get beyond that. He interpreted that largely, and largely he's correct, as the client. I don't want to go down I don't want to say patient. The client holding back. So you're using religious language to hold back the analysis. And it was Jung that said, well, yeah, maybe, but not all the time. But I think it was Jacob L. Moreno, who I think was a Romanian Jew, who actually confronted Freud on this and said, but I will outlast you. I want every single God concept imaginable in the room, in the therapy room with me. I want to know what people are talking about. I want to know why they're talking about those things. And that strikes me as much more comprehensive. Is the divine everywhere? Yes, it's in this conversation. It's in friendship. It's in family relationships when they're viable and when they work. Let's not over-romanticize the family. It's in all the things that are good in human life, particularly for me, the moral, when it's inexplicable, and goes against survival value, not because I'm trying to kick the sciences into touch. What a great blessing they are. But when they're clearly being shown something beyond their own limit, that's when I get particularly interested. Excuse me, again, not to diminish them, but to say, okay, where are we now? Where is all this leading? So that a sense of the sacred, Rudolf Otto and all of that, that's where I sort of, when my work, my personal witness tends to come into play. God, what a mouthful. Wow. What a mouthful, heavens.
Thank you, David. Can I call you back in 10 minutes so we'll discuss your creative works?
I'd be delighted, Richard. I'd be delighted. Give me a chance to have a sip of something.
Of course. All right. Speak soon. Thank you.
Speak soon.
Thank you for listening to a Fish Out of Water podcast. This is your host, Richard Lippmann. Should you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please get in touch.